All right. So we will go ahead and get started, but for all of us who are new, aka Elizabeth, welcome. So this is basically the idea of Right Night came about for a couple of purposes and is constantly evolving. But initially as a means for everybody to come co-work together and then be able to take breaks, both naturally and or scheduled as need be, to write and create content and just do things, whether it's for your own purposes or for schoolwork or what have you. It could be anything. It's basically like studying together with friends in the library, etc. But we've subsequently decided to try to add additional things to expand kind of the mission of the Snickle, which is to get people together to form community that's intentional, meaningful, and allowing us to have kind of a collision of the minds, and share things that we're thinking about, that we're feeling, that we're creating, and so on, in a very low key way, I guess, to say. So this is what Right Night is really about, and it takes multiple different forms. It's evolving and will probably continue to evolve. So that's kind of the background for everything. And so right now we have arrived at the subjugated listenings portion, where I have you all as a captivated audience, and no one is allowed to leave. I'm just kidding. Anyways, so without further ado, we will jump into tonight's conversation, which is on beauty. This is something that kind of struck me a couple of months ago as I was talking with one of my friends from undergrad when he was down visiting. And so I'll get into the thing that sparked this idea and then some of my musings and what I've read about it. And then we can open up the floor to discussion to be able to bounce ideas off. Because I think the real key part of this and where I found the most joy in contemplating it has been in dialogue thus far. So, to begin, the idea for tonight's speech came from a conversation I had earlier in the summer with a dear friend of mine from UVA who came down for the weekend for a visit. He stayed until Monday morning, and I was fortunate enough to have had a late start that day, so we went to breakfast at Chick-fil-A. At the table, we started on a meandering conversation, as one does at Chick-fil-A, and that wound up, and I don't even recall how, on the topic of the Sublime and the beautiful. It was then that we started to discuss what beauty really is. This then branched out into a broader discussion about the true and the good. An intellectual reflex developed by both of us after hearing speech after speech, appealing to these concepts at our debating society meetings so many years in the past. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the concepts when they're spoken of as a unit, the good, the true, and the beautiful have been cornerstones of Western philosophy and philosophical theory for millennia. Discussed in the early days of Greek philosophy, they were later baptized and subsumed in Christian theology and philosophy, recognized as avenues to access God that even the pre-Christian pagans could use to inch in closer to the Creator, inch as close to the Creator as possible without the aid of revelation. Called the Transcendentals, these concepts have typically been thought of as the deepest quanta of reality, irreducible themselves, yet codependent. They go hand in hand, and through these lenses, all matters of theology, ethics, arts, politics, etc. can be analyzed and understood. For this reason, it was much to my surprise that my friend John then raised a rather interesting point that I initially thought absurd, but later came to unsettle me as I considered it further. Sadly, my memory is terribly imperfect, and that's highly problematic given my choice of professions as a physician. And so I do not recall with great or accurate detail the point-by-point analysis he provided. However, the core of his arguments were that perhaps the ancients had been wrong when they demanded that a co-equal relationship between truth, goodness, and beauty. He noted that beauty seems derivative, that it is a useful mediator to access the divine, but can only properly do so in service to good or truth, and then to the divine, which those would allow direct access to. Indeed, it is goodness and truth that are the ultimate needs that we have in order to know God, and beauty is simply a helpful tool to amplify the things said of God by truth and goodness. beauty can be entirely cut out of the equation when thinking about God. Now, for those of you who may be listening to this podcast / audio recording, etc., what I'm about to do may be exceedingly unhelpful. However, for the audience here present, I will try to illustrate what I'm discussing. The ancients thought of these three concepts as being co-equal, in a way that might seem familiar when we think of other ideas within theology. But it is through this co-equal partnership that you can get to God in the center. What my friend was proposing, as I understood it, was that God is here, and there is a precipice, and at this precipice there are two thresholds, that of truth and that of goodness, which point to God. And then there's beauty here, a lens through which you can see either or perhaps neither, in which case you would never be able to access God. And then it is through these intermediaries that you can then see God. Now, this could be an issue of semantics, and I concede that perhaps I'm misunderstanding a key point to his argument, and perhaps even creating a straw man. But the more that I have thought about it, the more I find to be problematic with his description. So, indeed, there are several poignant counterexamples to argue against the emphasis of beauty as being transcendent and a means of understanding the divine. So recently I was speaking with Mara and one of our friends about problematic trends on social media. For instance, the Mormons tend to emphasize beauty in a very particular way. And this translates into an ethos online for the sake of evangelization, utilizing beauty. So the Mormons will tend to do this in a very particular embodied sense by promoting the use of influencers, particularly female influencers who are rather beautiful, in order to evangelize and send messages about their faith and create kind of a standard and a cultural milieu for Mormons to exist in online. And this is kind of not necessarily a cause, but almost a something derivative of a broader trend within Mormonism that leads to very high rates of eating disorders and plastic surgery in Utah and so on, because of this idea that one ought to be and must be beautiful in some sense in order to be able to fully appreciate and glorify God in some way. So in other words, what we see here is a practical distortion of something that many people would agree is good, beauty, and it is becoming warped and used for something very, very much not good. Another way that you could conceive of beauty and as something that leads one away from God, or that beauty itself is insufficient for understanding God, is thinking of something like what we see in our modern society. For example, beauty without truth. We've been surrounded by that with unsound art that could be, beautiful on the surface or technically well done, but communicate a horrific message. Or in the marketing theory of sex sells and all of these promiscuous advertisements. We also see beauty in it's when it lacks goodness. In this instance, the opulent flaunting of the wealthy in their particular artwork collections, or their mansions, or the way that they spend their money. And we also see it in propaganda. I'm very fond, actually, of the aesthetics of Soviet propaganda, and I think it's quite beautiful. Yet it's actually a very ungood thing. It's a remarkable concept because it can have shards of things that are noble, such as the beauty of the posters that they created, while still being fundamentally bad. And so these things surround us all the time. And so, put another way, beauty without truth or goodness is idolatry in some sense, right? And so I think this is perhaps what he was trying to get at, that beauty does not seem to be a surefire way of accessing God, whereas truth does seem to be a surefire way of accessing God. Because truth is bringing our mind and understanding corresponding one-to-one with reality. And so, regardless, while at first I started to become convinced of my friend's points, the more I've thought and read about the topic in the wake of our conversation, the more I am convinced that there was a fundamental misunderstanding in terms. To understand why the position that beauty is subservient to truth and goodness is wrong, it would be helpful to cover what the theological end of these concepts is, and then define all three in turn. So, when we think about truth, good, and the beauty, we are trying to think of these things as transcendentals, things that are going to transcend time and place and person and so on, to access something that goes beyond that which is seen. That they are essentially trying to connect what is on the surface to what is deep down, right? And as Catholics, we have a very sacramental worldview, for instance, right? That all of creation is an outward and visible sign of the inward and spiritual graces of God towards his created. And in other words, truth, beauty, and goodness are these concepts and ability for us to link what we see and how we interact and what we experience to God that goes beyond what's just in front of our eyes, right? So these are meant to be things that point to God. That beauty, yes, can be corrupted, but still points to God. But I will try to, and will endeavor to prove that the other two, devoid of the remainder, can also corrupt and not link to God. That they must go hand in hand, because all three are pointing to God. And just like if you had multiple people trying to describe blind people trying to describe what an elephant is, by just touching various parts of it, you might not get the full picture. You need to have all of these things in order to be able to access God and understand God. I think that my entire issue boils down to the problem of perspective and emphasis, therefore. Left alone, any of these cannot fully point to God, and they are all needed and will be found together. The Transcendentals should be orienting us to God, and when one gets to God having considered one of these Transcendentals, one will notice, once one has arrived and begins to look around, that the other two will always be found encompassing you. So, in other words, when we talk about truth, what are we talking about? So if we think about truth, we see it's the correspondence of a thing or idea with reality. That I believe such and such is the case, and it actually is. It is true, and verifiable. And that these things are reflecting that which is outside of us, that which has been created. God is the creator of all things, reality included. He is the creator of being. And so for truth to exist, it is going to show you the reality that God has created and point to God. But truth without goodness can still beget a lack of God, right? And so you can have things that are true and demonstrable. So for instance, you can say that people are poor, right? And then you could then say, okay, well, that is a fact. But you could easily conclude from that fact that people ought to be poor, because it ought to be, right? It is truth without reference to the good. And so you see these things as well. Truth without beauty, truth without good becomes sterile, it becomes dehumanizing, and it becomes something where we are tempted to make it our own because we're not thinking of it as a referential to others and to God. Regarding goodness, what is goodness? It is something that, how well something fulfills its purpose and its perfection in being. So we can talk about a good knife, for instance, is a knife that cuts well. And a bad knife is one that is not going to be effective in its cutting, right? But again, if we have goodness without truth, for instance, we get into things like kindness for kindness' sake, which is becoming more and more prevalent in our secular culture as the golden rule of the modern age, which is simply to be kind. You see bumper stickers of it all over the place and so on, and it is the same thing as being kind to an alcoholic by giving them what they ask for, right, which is more alcohol. And it would be a kind act to give somebody what they ask for, right, just as an abstract idea. But when applied to this particular situation, it can be something that is detrimental to that person, that can actually be undermining them. So when you are trying to do something good, but being short-sighted, you may actually be hurting someone and not participating fully in what goodness can and should be. So again, showing kind of an absence of this. So likewise, we arrive at the idea of beauty. So what then is beauty? Beauty is something that evokes delight and curiosity, I would say. It is the result of and our interaction with the well-orderedness and the radiating quality of something that is well-ordered, like a very perfectly designed machine, or a very expertly executed feat of sporting. So like an amazing catch of a frisbee in an end zone, for instance. Or it can be a skillfully put together argument. It can be all sorts of things. It can also be a beautiful piece of, like a beautiful urn, for instance. It could be all manner of things created by humans or created by God, right? Like a beautiful sunset, something that shows the order and magnifies the order that it represents. Beauty is something that is pre-rational. We don't have to sit there and understand why this thing is good, but we notice it immediately and internalize it immediately. So it is visceral, it is pre-rational, and it is a reflection of that well-ordered nature of a thing that is pointing towards its teleological end. So in some sense, it's a sacramental of God's goodness towards us. So the Catechism talks about how art, in particular, is an overflowing of the overabundance of humanity's inner richness. We express the truth of our relationship with God through beauty. And I think that's the other thing that beauty highlights, is this relationship. Again, going back to this definition of beauty, the well-ordered, it is, that radiance of something well-ordered and the impact that has on us. Well-ordered will imply a relation to something, a relation to the idea of the perfect form of that thing, or a relationship. And another form of beauty is a beautiful marriage, for instance, right? Like that there is well-ordered relationship between the spouses is a thing of beauty. So again, beauty is something that is deeply relational. And this is where we start to understand that you need to have that beauty in order for goodness to start to make sense, right? Like goodness only makes sense in terms of a relational nature, right? An act would be good in correspondence to something else. So like a good act towards another person, right? You could, hand out flowers to, empty trees all day. If there didn't exist any other person, the act of just handing out flowers to someone would not be considered to be good and charitable. It would be meaningless and kind of obtuse. So again, the beauty of that act is corresponding and drawing out and highlighting the goodness of it, but it is required as well by way of that relational nature. So I think Keats has a really interesting line from his Ode to a Grecian Urn. Truth is beauty, beauty truth. This is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. And Solzhenitsyn further elucidates some of these points in his Nobel Prize speech in 1970, quoting Dostoevsky's from The Idiot. And the operative phrase here is, beauty will save the world. But Solzhenitsyn says, so perhaps the ancient trinity of truth, goodness, and beauty is not simply an empty, faded formula as we were thought in the days of our self-confident materialistic youth. If the tops of these trees converge, as the scholars maintained, but the two direct stems of truth and goodness are crushed, cut down, not allowed through, then perhaps the fantastic, unpredictable, unexpected stems of beauty will push through and soar to that very same place, and do so, and in doing so will fulfill the work of all three. In that case, Dostoevsky's remark, beauty will save the world, was not a careless phrase, but a prophecy. After all, he was granted to see much, a man of fantastic illumination. So, in summary, I would say that all three of these ideas, these transcendental points, are pointing to God. This is the key. It is not that beauty points to truth and goodness and only through this conduit onward to God. Rather, it is that God can be known through this tripartite contemplation of reality. Indeed, upon further reflection, it becomes clearer that there is a need for each of these to be considered to allow us, created beings, to access the Lord. Truth speaks to our rational minds and logical bent, goodness to our sense of the moral order of the world that we inhabit, and beauty to the pre-rational and experiential interface with God and his creation. And so, again, it's all about accessing God. God has created this sacramental world in which reality exists separate and above us, and it is through the interactions, the rational interactions of truth, that we can come to know God, the moral understanding that God places on our heart, and the goodness that we can understand when we correspond to the will of God, and then our understanding and contemplation of the nature of the reality that surrounds us, and the realization and internalization of the beauty of that created reality. And through these three senses, if you will, that is how we get to know God. It would be similarly difficult to say that you would need to know, or you have all you need to know about the world if you were blind. And I think that beauty would be the sight in this sense. And so to rob the sight of its import in interacting with the world, this is, blatantly absurd. Obviously, people that are blind can still live meaningful lives, but it is at a cost. And so in a similar way, if we tried to approach God through only two of our senses, we too would be perhaps losing out on the fullness of that relationship with him. So that is my argument. It's not super fleshed out, and I think that I will have it better formulated for either a Snickle article or an editor's edition thing or something else. But those are my points.